He didn't even look at her face. That was the part Lenora Vance could never fully explain to anyone who asked, not the abandonment itself, not the humiliation of standing alone on that sun-baked platform with every stranger in Red Mesa watching. Not even the way her trunk sat beside her like a reminder that she had packed her entire life into something a man could simply walk away from. No. The part that cracked something deep and permanent inside her chest was the moment Brant Dillard's eyes dropped from her face to her leg just a flicker. Barely half a second, and everything in his expression shut down like a door being closed from the inside. He never said a word. He just turned, climbed up into his wagon, and drove away. If you've ever been judged for something you were born with, something you cannot change, something you've carried your whole life without complaint, then you already know exactly how Lenora felt standing in that Arizona dust. And if you haven't, stay with this story, because what happened next will make you believe that the right person always arrives after the wrong one leaves. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you stories just like this one. Stories about ordinary people who refuse to stay broken. Leave a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that platform. The train had been late by nearly 40 minutes, which meant Lenora had spent that extra time sitting rigid in her seat, rehearsing the first thing she would say. She had settled on something simple. Something that wouldn't sound rehearsed, even though it absolutely was. "Hello, Mr. Dillard. I'm Lenora. I hope the journey wasn't too inconvenient for you." Polite, practical, the kind of opening that left room for him to set the tone of whatever came next. She had been corresponding with Brant Dillard for 7 months. 7 months of letters moving back and forth between her small room in a St. Louis boarding house and a cattle ranch outside of town she had to look up on 3 separate maps before she found it. His letters were not poetic. He didn't write the way men in novels wrote to women they were pursuing. He wrote the way a man writes when he is genuinely trying to solve a problem. He needed a wife who could work. Someone who understood that ranch life was not comfortable and that he wasn't interested in pretending otherwise. He needed someone practical, patient, and honest. Lenora had written back that she was all 3. She'd told him about her grandmother's remedies, about the years she'd spent managing a household after her mother's illness, about the fact that she had never once in her adult life been afraid of physical labor. She'd also told him, clearly and without apology, about the limp, a childhood fever that had settled wrong in her left leg and never fully corrected itself. She walked with an uneven gait. She always had. She'd learned to manage stairs and long distances, but she would never move the way a woman without that history moved. Brant had written back a week later. He said it didn't concern him. What concerned him was character, not appearance. She had believed him. The train pulled into Red Mesa at just past 2 in the afternoon, and the heat that pressed through the window glass as they slowed into the station was the kind of heat Lenora had read about but never truly understood until it was sitting on her skin. She stood, gathered her traveling bag, and made her way down the narrow aisle toward the door. Her left leg was stiff from hours of sitting. It always stiffened when she'd been still too long, and she'd learned to give it a moment before she put her full weight on it. She came down the steps carefully. The platform was crowded with people meeting passengers, unloading freight, conducting the ordinary business of a busy afternoon. She scanned faces. She had no photograph of Brant. He hadn't sent one, and she hadn't pushed, but his last letter had described himself as tall, dark-haired, wearing a brown hat with a cord band. Spotted 3 men fitting that description within 30 seconds and felt a small, ridiculous spike of nerves. Then she saw him looking at her. He was standing perhaps 20 feet away, arms loose at his sides, and she knew immediately it was him because of the way he was standing still in the middle of all that movement. He had the look of a man who had come somewhere with a specific purpose and was currently evaluating whether that purpose was going to be fulfilled. His eyes were on her face, and for a single moment she thought, this is fine. This is going to be fine. Then she took her first full step off the platform stairs. It was a small thing, a half-second shift in her weight as her left leg found the ground. She'd done it 10,000 times. She barely noticed it anymore. But she saw the exact instant Brant Dillard noticed it, because his gaze dropped from her eyes to her leg with the precision of a man checking a horse before buying it. And what she saw move through his face in that fractional moment was not cruelty, exactly. It was disappointment, the quick pragmatic disappointment of someone who has received something that does not match what was described. She stopped walking. He kept looking at her leg for just a moment longer than was polite. Then he looked back at her face and she saw him make a decision. Couldn't have said what the decision was, not in words, because he didn't speak. He didn't move toward her. He didn't tip his hat or call her name or do any of the things a man meeting a woman who had traveled 1,000 miles on his word was supposed to do. He turned around. He walked back to his wagon at the far end of the platform. He climbed up. He settled the reins in his hands. And he drove away without a single word, without a single backward glance, leaving Lenora Vance standing in the Red Mesa train station with her traveling bag in one hand and her carefully composed greeting dying somewhere in her throat. For a long moment she didn't move. She was aware of people around her. She was aware that several of them had noticed. An older woman near the freight office had stopped what she was doing. A boy sitting on a barrel was openly staring. The station master himself had gone quiet in a way that told her he had seen exactly what happened and didn't know where to look. Lenora looked at the empty space where the wagon had been. She set her traveling bag down on the platform. And then she did the only thing she could think of to do, which was to find her trunk, identify a nearby hotel, and figure out what came next. She did not cry. This surprised her more than anything else about that afternoon. She had expected that if something went badly wrong, she would cry, because she was not a woman who pretended emotions didn't exist. But what she felt standing on that platform was not grief, not immediately. It was something quieter and more frightening than grief. It was the feeling of the floor dropping out from beneath a plan she had trusted with her whole life. The porter helped her with her trunk without being asked. He was a wiry older man with sun-cracked skin and eyes that had seen enough of the world to keep themselves carefully neutral. He didn't say anything about what had just happened. He just picked up her trunk and asked if she needed direction to decent lodging. "Yes," she said. "Please." She followed him off the platform and into the full force of the Arizona afternoon. The hotel was called the Mesa House, and it was neither as bad as she feared nor as good as she needed. The room was small, the window faced a wall, and the mattress had the particular quality of something that had once been good and had since given up on itself. Lenora sat on the edge of it for a long time after the porter left. She counted her money twice. She did it, methodically, the way her grandmother had taught her to approach any problem that felt too large. Start with what you actually have, not what you wished you had. What she actually had was $11 and some cents. She had her trunk of clothing and supplies. She had her traveling bag with her grandmother's remedy book, a small sewing kit, several important letters, and enough dried goods for perhaps 3 days if she rationed carefully. She had her return ticket, except that the return ticket was dated for 60 days from now, which meant she couldn't use it without paying a substantial fee to change the date, which she could not afford. She did not have a husband. She did not have a position. She did not have a single person in the state of Arizona who knew her name. She sat with all of that for a while. Then she opened her grandmother's remedy book to the first page, not because she needed a remedy, but because her grandmother had written something there years ago that Lenora had read so many times she knew it by heart. She read it again anyway. A woman who can make do with what she has in front of her is worth more than all the pretty ones who need things to be perfect. Make do. Move forward, cry later if you need to. Lenora closed the book. She blew out a slow breath. Then she went downstairs and asked the hotel owner if there was anyone in Red Mesa who might need a housekeeper, a cook, a seamstress, a nurse, or any combination of those things, because she was new in town and she was looking for work. The next 3 days were the most quietly humiliating of her life, and Lenora had experienced a fair share of quiet humiliation. Red Mesa was not a large town, but it was the kind of town that knew its own business thoroughly and was not shy about discussing it. By the morning after her arrival, the story of Brant Dillard's mail-order bride being left on the platform had made its way through at least 4 separate conversations that Lenora walked within hearing range of. She learned this not because people said things directly to her, most of them didn't. Most of them simply went quiet or looked away with that particular species of visible discomfort that indicated they knew exactly who she was, but because of the way information leaked around her at the edges. She tried the dressmaker first. The woman was sympathetic in the way of someone who genuinely felt sorry, but was also very conscious of the fact that Brant Dillard's mother was one of her regular customers. She said she wasn't hiring. She tried the mercantile, asking if they needed help with inventory or the counter. The owner, a round-faced man named Garrett, said he'd think about it and let her know. He never did. She tried 2 households she heard might need domestic help. One woman opened the door, recognized her name, and said she'd already found someone. The other didn't open the door at all. On the evening of the 3rd day, Lenora sat at the small table in her hotel room and did the mathematics again, even though she already knew what the mathematics said. She had enough left for perhaps 2 more nights. After that, she would need to either sleep elsewhere or find a way to cover the cost with work. The hotel owner, a decent enough woman named Mrs. Ferris, had offered to let her stay in exchange for helping with the laundry, if it came to that, and Lenora had said she would keep it in mind. She was keeping it in mind. She was also trying to think past it. It was Mrs. Ferris herself who mentioned the ranch. She came upstairs that evening to bring Lenora an extra blanket. The nights in Arizona dropped fast and hard. Something Lenora hadn't fully anticipated, and she stopped in the doorway with the look of someone who had been turning a thought over all day and finally decided to say it out loud. "I don't know if you've heard," Mrs. Ferris said, folding the blanket over the foot of the bed, "but there's a rancher out on the East Road. Rhett Calder, Dry Willow Ranch, they call it, about 6 miles out." She paused. "Nobody's been out there in a while. He bought supplies from Garrett maybe 2 weeks back, but Garrett said he looked wrong. Like a man running on nothing." Lenora looked at her. "Wrong house, sick," Mrs. Ferris said simply, "or close to it. And from what I understand, there's nobody out there with him. He lost his sister a few years back. She was the one who really ran the household. He never replaced her." She smoothed the blanket unnecessarily. "I'm not suggesting anything. I just thought you should know it existed, in case." After she left, Lenora sat with that information the way she'd sat with the money, turning it over, looking at it from different sides. Scenic smiles in this heat. With her leg, she thought about what waited for her if she didn't go. More doors not quite opening. More rooms turning slightly away when she walked in. More of the particular silence that said, "We know what happened to you, and we've already made up our minds about what that means." She thought about a man alone on a failing ranch who might be sick and might need help and might, possibly, need it badly enough that he wouldn't care one way or another about how she walked. She opened her grandmother's book again, Make Do, Move Forward. She started packing what she'd need to carry. She left before sunrise because she wanted to cover as much ground as possible before the heat became serious. She wore her most sensible boots and carried water, and she made it the first 2 miles without any real difficulty. By the 3rd mile, her leg was beginning to protest in the specific way it always did when she'd been walking longer than she was accustomed to, a deep, grinding ache that started in her hip and worked its way down to her ankle. She slowed her pace. She didn't stop. The road, calling it a road, was generous, wound out through scrub and dry grass, and the occasional cluster of rock formations that threw short, stubborn shadows in the early morning light. She passed nothing that looked lived in. She saw a hawk circle overhead with complete indifference to her existence. She counted her steps for a while because it gave her something to focus on besides the heat, which arrived earlier than she expected, and settled on her shoulders like something physical. She found Dry Willow Ranch at just past 9 in the morning. The first thing she noticed was the fence sagging badly. In several places, one section collapsed entirely into the dirt, as if it had simply lost the will to stand. The garden she could see from the road was a riot of dry, yellowed plants that had gone too long without water. The yard itself was scattered with the kind of debris that accumulated when no one had been tending it: a broken tool handle, a feed bucket on its side, a pile of something she couldn't identify that had dried into a shapeless heap near the barn. The house itself was still standing, which she registered as a cautious positive. She pushed open the yard gate. It stuck. She pushed harder and walked to the front door. She knocked 3 times, waited, knocked again. No answer. She tried the door. It opened. The smell hit her first, the particular smell of a sick room that had been closed for too long, sharp and stale and complicated. She stepped inside, letting her eyes adjust to the interior dimness, and saw him almost immediately. He was on the floor. Not on the bed. Not on a chair on the actual floor of the main room. Half against the wall, like a man who'd been trying to get up and hadn't made it. He was large. She registered that first because it was immediately relevant to the question of what she could physically do. Broad across the shoulders, longer than she'd expected, with dark hair plastered against his forehead with sweat. His face was flushed a color that she recognized from her grandmother's medical experience as not good. His breathing was shallow but present. She crossed the room, knelt beside him, despite the complaint from her leg, and put the back of her hand against his forehead. He was burning. "All right," she said quietly. To no one. To herself. To the shape of this situation she had walked 6 miles into. "All right, let's see what we're working with." She wasn't afraid. That surprised her later, when she thought about it. She had arrived in Arizona alone and been abandoned in front of strangers. She had spent 3 days being quietly turned away by an entire town. She had walked 6 miles in desert heat on a leg that had been hurting her for 20 years. Fear had been hovering around the edges of all of that, and she had kept moving through it. Standing in this stranger's house, looking down at a man who might be dying, she felt something settle in her chest that was almost the opposite of fear. She felt useful. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. His name, she found it on a letter on the table, was Rhett Calder. The wound was on his right forearm, a deep cut that had been poorly cleaned and then ignored long enough to become seriously infected. The skin around it was red and hot and swollen in a way that told her it had been going bad for several days at minimum. She used the water from her own canteen first, then found the well, then found what she needed in her bag. The small kit her grandmother had always called the emergency collection, which contained carbolic solution, clean linen strips, a needle already threaded with silk, and a collection of dried herbs that she knew exactly what to do with. She cleaned the wound. He didn't wake up fully. He stirred once and made a sound that was halfway between a groan and a word she couldn't make out, but he didn't pull away. She debrided what needed debriding, applied the carbolic, and packed it with a poultice her grandmother had shown her for exactly this type of infection. Then she moved him. This was the part that took the longest and cost her the most. She couldn't lift him. He outweighed her by a significant margin, and she had one dependable leg, but she could move him. She dragged a pallet close, got him onto it with his cooperation, even in his half-conscious state, and covered him with what clean blankets she could find in the house. She got water into him slowly, a few spoonfuls at a time, the way you approached someone who was too sick to swallow properly. She found wood for the stove and boiled water. She found the coffee and made some because she needed it. She found a chair and pulled it beside the pallet. Outside, the sun was overhead now, blasting down on Dry Willow Ranch with complete impartiality. Inside, Lenora Vance sat beside a stranger she had not planned to meet, in a house she had no claim to, in a state she had arrived in 5 days ago on someone else's word, and she watched him breathe and adjusted the cool cloth on his forehead every 20 minutes and waited to see which direction this was going to go. She had nowhere else to be. She had no one waiting on her. She realized, completely on her own in this decision and every decision that would follow it, and she found that the weight of that, which had felt crushing 3 days ago on a hotel bed, felt different here. It felt like something she could carry. Rhett Calder's breathing remained shallow but steady through the long afternoon. Lenora did not leave his side. Rhett Calder did not die that first night, but there were several hours when Lenora wasn't certain he wouldn't. The fever climbed through the late afternoon in that particular way. Fevers do, when they've been left alone long enough to establish themselves, not a sudden spike, but a slow, determined ascent, like something that had been building patience. She tracked it by touch, every 20 minutes, the back of her wrist against his forehead, and what she felt told her it was getting worse before it would get better. That was expected. That was in her grandmother's words, the infection arguing before it surrendered. The trouble was there was no guarantee it would surrender. She kept the cool cloths coming. She kept water going into him, a small spoonful at a time, working it past lips that were cracked and dry from what she estimated was at least 2 days of inadequate fluid. Found a pot and made a thin broth from dried beans she located in the kitchen. The kitchen was in a state that made her jaw tighten. Not from disgust, but from the specific frustration of looking at a space that had once clearly been organized and functional, and seeing what happened when illness and grief removed the person who'd been maintaining it. There were dishes that hadn't been washed in days, a crock of something that had gone bad enough to be dangerous, and a layer of dust on every surface that told her no one had cleaned in weeks. She didn't tackle it that night. She made the broth, she got some of it into Rhett, and she stayed in the chair beside him. Somewhere around midnight he started talking. It wasn't coherent, not entirely. Fever talking rarely was. He said a name several times that she thought was Clara, and the way he said it urgent, like someone trying to warn a person who was too far away to hear, told her something about him that she filed away without examining too closely. He said things about cattle, about water levels, about a fence line he kept returning to with the persistence of someone who believed the fence line was genuinely at risk. Once he said, very clearly, "Don't let them sell it," and then went quiet for a long stretch. She sat through all of it. She had learned to sit through difficult nights. Her mother's illness had been a long education in exactly that, the particular discipline of staying present in a room where things were going wrong and there was nothing to do but monitor and wait and not let your own exhaustion become the thing that decided the outcome. She wasn't good at stillness in ordinary life. She was better at it in crisis. She'd never been entirely sure what that said about her. Around 3 a.m, his breathing change deepened slightly, evened out in a way that felt like the body deciding to stop fighting the fever and start working with it instead. She checked his forehead. Still hot, but the quality of the heat had shifted. She'd felt this before. It wasn't over, but the direction had changed. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding since approximately 9 that morning. Then she put her head back against the chair, closed her eyes, and let herself rest for what she told herself would be an hour. She slept for 4. When she woke, pale morning light was coming through the one window that didn't have its shutter pulled, and Rhett Calder was watching her. He wasn't fully alert. His eyes had the particular unfocused quality of someone operating significantly below their normal capacity, but they were open and they were tracking her, which was substantially better than unconscious and burning up on the floor. She sat up straight, feeling the specific consequences of a night in a wooden chair along every inch of her spine, and looked at him. "You're awake," she said. He looked at her for a moment. His voice, whence it came, was rough in the way of someone who hadn't spoken in days. "Who are you?" It wasn't quite a question, more like a man identifying the most pressing piece of information he was currently missing. "Lenora Vance," she said. "I arrived yesterday morning. You were on the floor." He seemed to be processing this. She watched him look at the ceiling, then at the window, then back at her, assembling context from whatever was available to him. "My arm," he said. "Infected, badly. I cleaned it and poulticed it. The fever broke around 3 this morning, or started breaking. You're not out of trouble yet, but you're better than you were." He looked at her for another long moment. There was something careful in his eyes, something assessing, but it wasn't hostile. More like a man who had learned not to accept things at face value and was taking his time. "How'd you get here?" he said. "I walked." "From where?" "Red Mesa." That landed. She saw it register the 6 miles, the terrain, the heat, and something in his expression shifted slightly. Not quite surprise, something quieter than surprise. "Why?" he said. Lenora considered the question. She could give him the practical answer. which was true. She needed work, and he was said to need help. She could give him the longer answer, which was also true, but would require explaining Brant Dillard and the train station, and 3 days of closed doors, and she didn't think this was the moment for that. You needed help, she said. I had the kind of help you needed. That seemed like enough reason. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, I don't have money to speak of right now. I know, Mrs. Ferris told me the situation. Then why? Because I didn't have anywhere else to go, she said. And the simplicity of it, the plain, unvarnished truth of it, seemed to be more persuasive than anything more complicated would have been. She saw him take it in. She saw him decide for the moment to leave it there. All right, he said, and then after a pause that felt like effort, thank you. You can thank me when you can stand up, she said. Right now I'm going to make you eat something. He slept most of that second day, which was what he needed, and also what she needed him to do, because it gave her time to address the house. She started with the kitchen, because the kitchen was where things could go genuinely dangerous if left unattended, and then worked outward from there. She wasn't trying to transform anything. She was trying to establish a minimum level of function, the kind of baseline that allowed the rest of life to happen. The bad crock she buried, the dishes she washed in water she heated on the stove, the surfaces she wiped down. She found the cleaning supplies in a lean-to off the back of the house, most of them still serviceable, and she used them methodically and without sentiment. By late afternoon, the kitchen was clean. The main room was manageable, and she had identified the most pressing problems with the rest of the house, which she categorized mentally into things that needed immediate attention and things that could wait a week. The garden she looked at from the back door and felt a complex emotion that was partly grief on behalf of whoever had planted it. It wasn't dead. Some things were more stubborn than they looked, but it was close, and getting water to it in a systematic way was going to require more physical capacity than she currently had, given that she'd spent the previous night in a chair and walked 6 miles the morning before. She gave herself until tomorrow for the garden. She went back inside and sat down with her grandmother's remedy book and thought through what Rhett Calder was going to need over the next 10 days if his arm was going to heal properly. She made a list. She looked at the list and thought about the fact that she had no money to speak of, and the nearest mercantile was 6 miles away, in a town that had already demonstrated it wasn't especially inclined to extend her goodwill. Then she thought about what she did have. She had the remainder of her dried goods. She had what was in Rhett's kitchen, which wasn't abundant but wasn't nothing. She had her grandmother's book, which covered a significant number of situations, using materials that could be found in a working garden or a local landscape, if you knew what you were looking for. She had a strong back, 2 functional hands, and 20 years of experience making do. She started making a different kind of list. Rhett woke properly on the 3rd morning, properly meaning he was able to sit up without assistance, hold a cup with his good hand, and speak more than a few words at a time without it costing him visibly. He still had color in his face that wasn't quite right, and he tired quickly. But the focused, coherent quality of his eyes was back, and he held himself differently, more present, less like a man who was somewhere between here and not here. He sat at his own kitchen table, which was clean in a way he clearly noticed because he ran his hand across the surface and looked up at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. You did all this, he said. Not quite a question. The house needed it. He looked around the kitchen slowly. She could see him taking inventory, registering the changes. His expression was complicated, something that mixed gratitude with a kind of discomfort that she thought she understood. The discomfort of a man who was self-sufficient by nature and by necessity being confronted with evidence that he had needed help badly enough that a stranger could come in and be this useful. My sister used to keep it like this, he said. Lenora set a bowl of porridge in front of him and sat down across the table. Mrs. Ferris mentioned you'd lost her. 3 years back. He picked up the spoon with his left hand. The right was still bandaged and looked at the bowl for a moment before he started eating. Clara. She was the one who she handled most of the indoor side of things. I'm not. He stopped, tried again. I let it go. There were several things Lenora could have said to that. She chose the one that was most honest without being more than the moment required. That happens. He ate in silence for a while. She drank her coffee. Outside, something she'd propped against the garden fence the evening before had apparently fallen over, and she made a mental note to deal with it. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 3 days. Up 3 days. "You weren't in a position to be helpful for most of it," she said. Or to object, for that matter. Something moved in his face that might, under different circumstances, have become the beginning of something like a smile. It didn't quite get there, but she registered the direction. "What happened to your leg?" he said. She looked at him steadily. Most people asked around that question, not directly at it, and she'd developed a mild but genuine irritation with the circling approach. Direct she could handle. "Childhood fever," she said. "Left some damage. I've had it my whole life." He nodded once, matter-of-factly, and returned to his porridge. No further comment, no visible recalibration of how he was looking at her. She noticed that. She filed it in the same place she'd filed the name Clara, which was the part of her mind that was quietly building a picture of Rhett Calder from the pieces he was putting out without realizing he was putting them out. "I need to change your dressing this morning," she said. "And I need to be honest with you about what I'm seeing in the wound, because you're going to have to make some decisions about the next 10 days. He pushed the empty bowl aside and looked at her with the attention of a man who was not afraid of plain information. "Tell me," she told him. The infection had responded well to the initial treatment, but it wasn't fully cleared. It rarely was in 3 days, with a wound that had been allowed to sit that long. He needed to keep the arm elevated when he wasn't using it. He needed to avoid using it for at least a week, which she recognized was going to be a significant problem given the state of the ranch. He needed the dressing changed twice daily with carbolic, and she needed to find certain plants she'd identified in her grandmother's book that should, if she was reading the landscape right, be available in the dry creek bed she'd seen to the east of the property. He listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "And if I ignore most of that and go fix the south fence because it's been down for 2 weeks, then the infection comes back worse than it was," she said. "And the next person who finds you on the floor might not know what to do with you." He was quiet for a moment. "Fair enough," he said. The 10 days that followed were not simple, and they were not comfortable, and they were not in any sense that she could have articulated easy. But they had a quality that Lenora had not felt since before her mother got sick, which was the quality of days that were full in the right way. Days where the work she was doing was work that mattered, and the evidence of it was visible. Rhett Calder was not an easy man to help. That was the first thing she understood about him. He was not rude about it, and he was not ungrateful, he said. Thank you with a regularity that told her the word actually meant something to him, that he wasn't using it as social grease, but he was constitutionally uncomfortable with limitation. And being limited to one functional arm while his ranch deteriorated around him was a particular form of misery for a man of his temperament. She could see it in the way he sat by the window watching the yard. She could see it in the carefully controlled way he moved around the house, doing what he could with his left hand, which was not his dominant hand, and tolerating it with the rigid patience of someone who was more accustomed to working through pain than around it. She made him sit down every time she caught him trying to do something that required his right arm. He complied, but she could see what it cost him. "Tell me what needs doing," she said on the 4th day, sitting across from him at the table with a piece of paper. In order of what happens if it waits a week versus what happens if it waits a month. And be specific. He looked at the paper, then at her. "You're going to fix the fence. I'm going to assess the fence. And the garden. And the livestock situation, which I've been managing on a basic level, but haven't had time to look at properly. Tell me what I need to know," he told her. And what she discovered over the course of that conversation and several that followed it was that Rhett Calder knew his land with the particular intimacy of someone who had grown up on it and then spent years almost losing it. He knew which water sources were reliable and which went dry in summer. He knew which sections of fence were most critical to the cattle's ranging patterns. He knew the garden soil in the way of someone who had watched Clara work it for years and absorbed more than he'd realized. He had underneath the damage that grief and isolation had done to this place, a genuine and detailed understanding of what it needed to function. He just hadn't been able to execute any of it. What she had was different: the capacity to work, the knowledge to prioritize, and the particular ruthlessness of a woman who had nothing left to lose by trying. She couldn't fix a fence line by herself that was honest, but she could identify which sections were the most urgent. She could make temporary repairs that bought time. She could get water to the garden on a system. She could manage the animals with enough competence to keep them from adding to the crisis. She did those things. Every day, she did what was in front of her. Rhett watched from the window those first days, and she could feel him watching, not in an uncomfortable way, but in the way of a man who was paying genuine attention to something he hadn't expected. On the 6th day, he came outside. "I told you to rest," she said, not looking up from the section of fence she was trying to wire back together with materials she'd found in the barn. "You've been doing it wrong," he said, coming to stand beside her. She looked up at that. He was looking at the fence with the expression of a man who couldn't watch incorrect fence repair without physically intervening. His right arm was in its sling. He looked at her. "If you cross the wire here instead of there, it holds better," he said. "Can I show you?" She handed him the wire and stepped back. He showed her with one hand, which took longer and was visibly frustrating to him. But he showed her, and he was right. The crossed configuration held differently, more securely, and she saw exactly why immediately. "That's better," she said. "Clara learned it from our father," he said. "I don't know who he learned it from." They worked side by side for the next 2 hours, her doing the physical portions that required 2 hands, him directing and doing what he could with his left, and by the time they stopped for the midday heat, they had repaired 40 feet of fence line. It was not a transformation, it was 40 feet. But Rhett Calder looked at those 40 feet with an expression that was something between relief and something that had been missing from his face since she'd arrived, something she tentatively identified as the particular satisfaction of a man who is still a rancher. "You didn't have to do any of this," he said. They were sitting in the thin shade of the barn's east wall, passing a water canteen back and forth. "I know," she said. "I want to understand why you did." She thought about it. She owed him the real answer, she decided. Not the practical version she'd given him when he first woke up. "Came out here with a plan," she said, "for a life, for a future. And the plan, the person who was supposed to be part of it, decided I wasn't what he wanted when he saw me walk. Decided before he'd said a single word to me." She kept her eyes on the fence line. "I had nothing. I had a hotel room I couldn't afford for much longer, and a town that felt very sure it knew what to think of me. And then I heard about a man who was sick and alone, and his ranch was falling apart, and I thought that's something I can actually do something about." She looked at him then. It wasn't entirely selfless. I needed somewhere to be useful. Rhett was quiet for a moment. He had the kind of face that didn't give away everything it was thinking, but she'd been studying it for 6 days, and she was starting to learn its vocabulary. "This man," he said. "Who decided you weren't what he wanted?" "Brant Dillard," she said. "He had a ranch outside of town. We'd been corresponding for 7 months. I was supposed to be his bride." The word still felt strange in her mouth, past tense, applied to herself. "He saw me get off the train and he left." Rhett was very still. "Without speaking to you," he said. "Without speaking to me." Something went through his face that was not a complicated emotion. It was a very simple one, the particular and clear anger of a man who has understood something and found it genuinely contemptible. He didn't say anything else about it immediately. He handed her the canteen and looked at the fence. But later that evening, when she was changing his dressing and he was sitting with the particular patience he'd developed for this twice-daily process, he said, without looking at her, "You walked 6 miles in desert heat on a leg that's been giving you trouble for 20 years, to help a complete stranger you'd never met, because he needed help." She tied off the bandage. "That's more or less accurate. And that man," he said, "looked at the way you walk and decided you weren't worth his time." Evidently, Rhett looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then at her. There was something in his face that was very level and very direct. "He's a fool," he said. It wasn't said with heat. It was said the way a man states an objective conclusion. I want you to know I'm saying that as someone who needed about 6 days to earn the right to say anything at all. But he's a fool. Lenora looked at him for a moment. She was not accustomed to people saying things like that about what had happened to her. Most people's response had been somewhere in the range of awkward sympathy or careful non-opinion. Rhett Calder's response was different. It was simpler. It sounded like what someone says when they're not trying to make you feel better, so much as saying what they actually believe. Thank you, she said. I'm not being kind, he said. I'm being accurate. She picked up her supplies and stood. Sometimes those are the same thing, she said. And she went back to the kitchen to start supper. On the 8th day, 3 things happened that changed the temperature of the situation in ways that would take Lenora several days to fully process. The first was that she got the garden properly watered for the first time since her arrival. She'd been doing it unevenly. The system of channels and containers she'd been improvising wasn't efficient, but she'd spent the previous evening working out a better arrangement using 2 barrels she'd found in the barn. A length of hose Rhett told her was behind the water trough, and a gravity-fed logic she'd figured out from watching how the land tilted. That morning she opened the system before dawn and stood watching water move through the garden channels with the slow, quiet efficiency of something that was actually working. 2 of the plants she'd thought were dead had leaves with the faintest green still in them. She marked those. They were worth trying for. The second thing was that a man from town came. She was still in the garden when she heard the horse, and she stood and turned to see a rider coming up the road at a pace that said he was not in a hurry. He pulled up at the gate and looked at her with undisguised curiosity, and she looked back at him with the neutral expression she'd developed in 3 days of Red Mesa, turning slightly away from her. He was middle-aged, weathered in the reliable way of men who spent most of their lives outdoors, and he had a kind of face that wasn't immediately legible, not unfriendly, but not committed to friendliness either. "You the woman from the train?" he said. She considered the various ways she could answer that. "I'm Lenora Vance," she said. "Can I help you?" He looked past her at the house. "Heard Rhett was sick. Wanted to see for myself. He's better. He's inside. You're welcome to go in." She went back to her garden. She heard him knock. Heard Rhett's voice. Heard the door close. She kept working. Whatever was said inside was between Rhett and whoever this man was, and she'd learned in the last several days that Rhett was not a man who needed managing. He handled what he handled. She handled what she handled. The man came out 20 minutes later. He stopped on his way back to his horse and looked at the garden, then at the fence line to the south that she and Rhett had been systematically repairing. "You did all that," he said. "Most of it," she said. "Rhett directed the fence when I was doing it wrong." The man looked at her for a moment. "I'm Wallace Pruitt," he said. "I run the Cold Spring Ranch about 3 miles east. Me and Rhett go back." She nodded. She was waiting to find out what he wanted. "People in town are talking," he said. It wasn't accusatory. It was said as information. "About you being out here. Unmarried woman. Man on his own. You understand. I understand," she said. "I'm not particularly concerned with what people in town are talking about." Something happened in his face at that not offense, more like recalibration. As if she had said something he hadn't expected from someone in her position. "Rhett's a good man," he said. "He's had a rough few years. He seemed to be searching for what he actually meant." "I want to make sure he's all right." "He's going to be all right," she said. "His arm will heal completely if he manages it properly for another week. The ranch needed tending, and I've been tending it." She met his eyes. "I'm not taking advantage of him, if that's the question." Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Wasn't the question I was asking, but I appreciate the directness." "What was the question you were asking?" He looked at the garden again. "I guess I was asking if he had someone looking out for him." "He does," she said. Pruitt nodded slowly. He remounted his horse and looked at her from the additional height with an expression that had shifted from its original wariness to something she thought might be the beginning of respect, or at least the beginning of an open question where before there had been a closed one. "Dillard knows you're out here," he said. "It wasn't a warning exactly." "He's welcome to know," she said. He left without anything further, and she watched him go and then turned back to her garden and stood there for a moment thinking about the name Dillard, about the way it landed differently now than it had a week ago. A week ago, the name had represented everything she'd lost: the plan, the future, the entire architecture of the life she'd been building in her head for 7 months. Standing in this garden, in this dry Arizona morning, with 40 feet of repaired fence line behind her, and a man inside who had called her capable in the plainest possible way, and meant it, the name felt smaller than it had. It felt like the name of a problem that had been solved already, even if the solution hadn't looked anything like what she'd planned. She went back to the garden. The third thing that happened that day was smaller than the other two, and larger than all of them. Rhett came outside in the late afternoon, moving carefully but moving, and he walked the perimeter of the property the way a man walks a piece of land he hasn't seen in a while, slowly, taking stock, stopping at intervals to look at specific things. She watched him from the corner of her eye while she was working on the second barrel system. He stopped at the garden for a long time. He walked down to the south fence and stood there. He went to the barn and came back out after a few minutes. He came and stood near her. "The yield from this garden," he said, "if it recovers properly, and it looks like it could supply the house through the winter and have excess." "I estimated the same," she said, "excess that could sell in town." "I thought about that." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know what you're planning," he said after. "When things are settled here, I don't know if you have somewhere you're going, or something you're intending." She set down what she was doing and looked at him. "I don't have anything decided," she said honestly. "I've been taking it one day at a time." He nodded. He looked at the garden. "I'm not good at asking things like this," he said. "I should tell you that up front so you understand the asking might not come out exactly right." "All right," she said, and waited. "Would you consider staying?" he said. "Not as I'm not offering you something you didn't ask for and don't want. I mean staying on in a working capacity. There's a room that was Clara's that's been empty. The ranch needs what you've been doing to it, and I can't do all of it alone, especially not right now." And he stopped. He looked at her with the frustration of a man who had correctly identified the limits of his own language. "The work you've done here matters," he said, "and I think you need somewhere that sees that." Lenora looked at him for a moment. She thought about the hotel room in Red Mesa. She thought about $11 and a return ticket she couldn't afford to change. She thought about the garden with the 2 plants that might still be alive, and the 40 feet of fence, and the kitchen she'd scrubbed back to something functional, and the 3 days and nights she'd sat beside this man while he was sick and fought to make sure the fever went the right direction. She thought about what it meant to be somewhere that had needed exactly what she had to give. "I'll stay," she said. Rhett nodded. There was something in his face that was not quite relief, and not quite anything else she had a name for. Something that looked like a man who had been holding a breath for 3 years and had just let a small amount of it out. "I'll pay you when the cattle sell in the fall," he said. "Fair enough," she said. She picked up what she'd set down and went back to work, and Rhett stood there for another moment in the afternoon light before he turned and went back toward the house, and neither of them said anything else about it, because there was nothing else that needed saying. But something had shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself. More the way the balance of a thing shifts when one weight is added or removed, the whole structure finds a new equilibrium, and it holds differently than it did before. Dry Willow Ranch was still a struggling property with too much debt and too many problems, and a man with one working arm, and a woman who was operating on stubbornness and her grandmother's remedy book. The fences were still mostly broken, the herd was still depleted. The debts weren't going anywhere on their own, but the direction had changed. And in Lenora's experience, direction was everything. She had come to Arizona expecting a man to give her a life. She had not expected to start building one herself, and she had not expected that building it would feel like this, not like loss compensated for, not like settling, but like something that was genuinely, specifically hers. Red Mesa was still 6 miles away. Brant Dillard was still there. The town's opinion was still what it was. Those things were still true. But they felt, for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, like something in the distance rather than something pressing directly against her chest. She worked until the light failed. Then she went inside and made supper, and Rhett Calder ate it at a clean kitchen table in a house that smelled like something other than sickness. And outside, the stars came out over the Arizona territory with the complete indifference of things that have been there long enough to have seen all of this before. The first time Lenora went back into Red Mesa was because they needed salt, carbolic solution, and a length of good rope, and there was no avoiding it any longer. Rhett offered to go himself. His arm was well enough by then, nearly 3 weeks out from when she'd found him, that he could manage a wagon with both hands if he was careful. And he said so with the particular casualness of a man who was trying to make something easier for someone else without drawing attention to the fact that he was doing it. She recognized the gesture. She appreciated it. She also understood that if she let him go in her place every time the town made her want to avoid it, she would spend the rest of her time at Dry Willow Ranch building a smaller and smaller world. And she had not walked 6 miles through desert heat to build a smaller world. "I'll go," she said. "I need to know what we're dealing with in terms of supply pricing anyway." "Better I see it directly." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd come to know as his thinking face, not blank, not closed, but occupied in a way that suggested he was deciding something internally. Then he said, "I'll come with you. You don't need to." "I know," he said, and went to hitch the wagon. They didn't discuss it further. That was one of the things she had learned about Rhett Calder in 3 weeks of living, and working alongside him, he didn't explain himself at length when a decision was made. He just made it and moved. It was, she thought, both a quality she found genuinely restful after a lifetime of people who talked around everything, and occasionally a quality that made her want to hand him a complete sentence and say, "Use the whole thing, please." The wagon ride into Red Mesa took the better part of an hour on the rutted East Road, and spent most of it in the comfortable silence they'd developed, punctuated by practical conversation about what they needed and how much they could afford to spend given where the ranch accounts stood. Accounts were not good. She knew this because she'd helped Rhett go through them the previous week, a process that had been conducted with the mutual grimness of 2 people looking at a true situation and refusing to pretend it was something else. The debts were real. The cattle were fewer than they should be. Fall sale was their clearest path to solvency, and that was still months away. In the meantime, they spent carefully, and they stretched what they had. Red Mesa announced itself first as a smear of structures against the flat landscape, then as the sound of it horses' voices, the particular acoustic character of a place that was always conducting multiple conversations at once. Lenora sat straight in the wagon seat and watched it approach, and told herself it was just a town, just people, just the ordinary noise of a place that had known about her for 3 weeks, and had made certain conclusions, and would now have to decide whether to revise them. The first person who saw them was a woman coming out of the dressmaker's. She stopped. She looked at the wagon. She looked at Lenora, then at Rhett, then back at the wagon as it passed. She didn't say anything, but the looking itself was its own kind of speech. Lenora looked straight ahead. Rhett pulled the wagon up outside Garrett's mercantile and set the brake and climbed down. He came around and offered her a hand for the step down, which she took without comment. The step was high enough that it was genuinely useful, and she'd stopped performing independence in situations where practical help was simply practical. They went inside together. Garrett was behind the counter. He was the same round-faced man who had told her 3 weeks ago that he'd think about giving her work, and then hadn't. He looked at her now with the expression of a man encountering something he hasn't fully classified, then looked at Rhett. And whatever calculation happened in the next half second produced a visible shift in his posture. "Rhett," he said, "good to see you on your feet. Heard you'd been sick." "Better now," Rhett said. He put the list on the counter. "We need these things." Garrett looked at the list. He looked at Lenora again briefly, then back at the list. "Most of this I have. The carbolic I'll need to check the back." "Take your time," Lenora said. While Garrett was in the back, a woman came into the store. She was perhaps 60, carrying a basket, and she stopped when she saw Lenora with the startled quality of someone who had expected a space to be empty. She recovered quickly, or tried to, and went to the dry goods section without speaking. Lenora moved to look at the thread selection, which she genuinely needed to look at because 3 weeks of hard use had depleted what she'd brought with her. The woman at the dry goods was making a performance of not looking at her that was more conspicuous than simply looking would have been. Lenora selected her thread colors and brought them to the counter and set them down and waited. Garrett came back with the carbolic. He wrote up the total. Rhett paid from the ranch account and didn't flinch at the number, which told Lenora he'd already expected it to be about that much. They were gathering the parcels when the bell above the door opened again and the temperature in the room changed in the specific way rooms change when someone enters who carries their own weather. She didn't need to turn to know. She felt it first in the way Garrett's attention shifted, a micro adjustment, the kind that happened around someone whose opinion of you mattered for business reasons. Then she heard the boot steps, and then she heard the voice. Well, Brant Dillard said, "I'll be." She turned. He was the same as she remembered, and completely different, the same height, the same dark hat, the same broad build of a man who worked outdoors. But in her memory, he had the size of someone who had done something enormous to her, and standing here now, he was just a man in a mercantile in a small town, looking at her with an expression that was performing amusement, but contained something underneath that she couldn't identify immediately, and then could. It was irritation. The irritation of someone who expected a situation to have resolved itself and found that it had not. He looked at Rhett. He looked back at her. "Didn't expect to see you still in the territory," he said. It was addressed to her, but said in the way of someone performing for the room. "Didn't expect to stay," she said. "Things changed." "So I hear." The amusement sharpened slightly. "Hear you've been out at Dry Willow. Helping out." The pause before helping out was doing work she could feel. "Good of you." Rhett's always needed someone to take pity on him. Rhett said nothing. She could feel him beside her still, the way he went still when he was paying close attention to something, but he didn't speak. "I'm not there out of pity," Lenora said. "I'm there because the ranch needed work and I can work." Brant's expression did the thing where amusement was weaponized into condescension. "Of course," he said. Very practical arrangement. Garrett he redirected to the store owner smoothly, the practiced ease of a man who understood how to control social space I need, to settle my account and pick up that order. He moved to the counter. Conversation effectively closed. Lenora picked up her parcels. Rhett picked up his. They walked out of the mercantile into the afternoon sun, and she made sure the rhythm of her walk was exactly what it always was, not slower, not faster, not adjusted 1 degree for the audience she knew was watching through the window. On the wagon, neither of them spoke for the first few minutes. Town moved past them on either side as they headed back toward the east road. Then Rhett said, "He did that on purpose." "Yes," she said. "Pity thing, yes." Another few minutes of road. "Does it work?" he said. "On you. Does it land the way he wants it to?" She thought about it honestly. The way she'd learned to think about things since arriving in Arizona, not the way she wanted them to be, the actual way they were. "It did 3 weeks ago," she said. Standing on that platform, it would have worked completely. Right now, she considered, it's more like watching someone try a key in a lock it doesn't fit anymore. I can see what he's trying to do. I just don't feel it the same way. Rhett was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said, "just that." She looked at the road ahead. The dry landscape opened up around them. Scrub and rock and the enormous indifferent sky, and somewhere ahead the ranch was there, and the garden she'd been nursing back, and the fence line they'd been working on section by section, and the life she was building out of whatever she could find to build it with. "He's going to keep doing it," she said, "whenever we come to town. He's that kind of man." "I know what kind of man he is," Rhett said. She looked at him. He was watching the road with the level attention he gave to things he was taking seriously. "The question," he said, "is what we do about it." She didn't have an answer to that yet. She filed it in the place where she kept things that needed more time. The weeks after that first trip had a different texture. The ranch was slowly, and she meant slowly in the most honest sense, meaning there were days when progress was invisible and you had to look at where you'd been 2 weeks ago to see it at all becoming something functional. The garden recovered more than she'd hoped. The 2 plants she'd marked as maybe alive came back with a stubbornness that felt personal, like they were making a point. She expanded the watering system and planted a second row of the things that were doing best, which were the root vegetables, turnips, beets, a variety of onion that the dry soil seemed to actively prefer. Rhett's arm healed to the point where he could use it for most things, with the exception of sustained heavy lifting, which he was told by every practical authority, including Lenora, to avoid for another few weeks, and which he avoided for about 1 week and a half before quietly returning to full capacity. She didn't argue. She'd seen enough of the way he was built in terms of character, not just the physical, to know that telling him to rest was best done in the form of making sure he had enough other things to think about. He did. There was always enough to think about. Wallace Pruitt came by twice more. The second time he stayed for supper, and the conversation at the table had the quality of 3 people who had each decided the others were worth the investment of genuine attention. Pruitt was drier than he first appeared. His humor ran toward understatement and the kind of observation that arrived 4 seconds after the moment it referenced, which made it land differently than humor that announced itself. He talked about his own operation with the frankness of someone who didn't see the point of pretending his problems weren't what they were. He also, over the course of the meal, gave Rhett some information about a cattle buyer coming through the district in early fall who was paying better than the usual Red Mesa prices, and told Lenora without any particular ceremony that the woman who ran the boarding house in town, a Mrs. Ferris, had been speaking well of her to several people. "She say why?" Lenora asked. "Said you were the only person who'd ask the right questions when you were in trouble," Pruitt said. "Something about the difference between people who look for someone to fix things and people who look for the information they need to fix things themselves." He looked at his plate. "She seemed to think that said something about your character." Lenora thought about Mrs. Ferris, about the extra blanket and the information about Dry Willow Ranch, about the quiet way that woman had handed her the piece of information that changed everything without making it into something more than it was. "She's a good woman," Lenora said. "She is," Pruitt agreed. "Red Mesa has a few of them. They're just not always the loudest voices in the room." It was after Pruitt left that Rhett said, sitting at the table with his coffee, "He's trying to tell us something. That there are people who aren't opposed to us," she said. "That the town isn't uniform. That we have more standing than it might feel like from the outside of it." She thought about Brant Dillard's face in Garrett's Mercantile. The performance of it, the way it had been directed at the room as much as at her. "He's been managing what the town thinks of him for a long time," she said. "Brant, he's good at it." "He is," Rhett said. "He's also been the largest personality in a small space for a long time. Those people are good at it until they're not." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" He wrapped both hands around his mug in the way he did when he was working through something. "A man like that runs on a certain kind of credibility. Social credibility. The kind where everyone assumes he's right about things because they've always assumed it, and no one's given them a reason to think otherwise." He looked at her. "The moment they have a reason, the whole thing gets reassessed. He doesn't just lose that argument. He loses the accumulated credibility of every argument before it." "That would require someone to give the town a reason," she said. "It would," he agreed. The conversation ended there, but it didn't leave the room. It sat in the air between them through the rest of the evening, a question in the shape of a statement. It was in the 5th week at Dry Willow that Lenora made her first sale. It wasn't large, a bundle of fresh turnips and 6 jars of a preserved onion relish she'd made from the surplus, because preserving surplus was something her grandmother had drilled into her at an age when she'd found it tedious and now found invaluable. She'd packed them into a crate and brought them to the Mercantile on the weekly supply run, and she'd asked Garrett directly whether he'd be interested in stocking them for resale. Garrett had looked at the jars. He'd opened one and smelled it, and looked at it with the professional interest of a man thinking about his customers' preferences. He'd said he'd take them on a trial basis at a price she'd considered and agreed was fair. She'd come home and told Rhett, and he'd looked at her with the expression She still didn't have a complete name for something between satisfaction and something else, something warmer, and said, "Good." "It's not much," she said. "It's the start of a thing," he said. Starts are what matter. The relish sold out in 4 days. Garrett sent a note with the next person heading out the East Road, asking for more. After that, she began keeping more careful account of the garden's output. What could be preserved, what could be sold fresh, what the timing was for each crop. She found her grandmother's notes on extending growing seasons in dry climates and tried 2 of the techniques, one of which failed completely and one of which extended her onion harvest by nearly 3 weeks. Rhett watched all of this with attention that was by now familiar, the particular quality of his focus when he was registering something he thought was important. He didn't comment on everything she did. He wasn't a man who narrated. But she had learned to read what he noticed, by what he came and stood near when she was working, by what he asked about when they talked in the evenings. One evening he asked her about what she knew about diversifying crops into something the market consistently wanted. "Why?" she said. "Thinking about the East Field," he said. "It's not good cattle land, the soil's wrong, and it's too far from the waterline to be practical. But I've been watching what you're doing with the kitchen garden, and I'm wondering what that same soil would do with the right crop." She thought about it. They talked for 2 hours. It was the kind of conversation she'd never had before, purely practical, fully engaged. 2 people who were both bringing something genuine to the table and building something neither of them could have built alone. She'd had pleasant conversations. She'd had useful conversations. She hadn't had many that were both at once in the way these were, where the pleasantness came from the usefulness rather than existing separately from it. At some point in the second hour, she became aware that it was late, and the lamp between them was burning lower than it had been, and they'd been talking so long the coffee had gone cold, and neither of them had noticed. She noticed Rhett noticing the same thing. He looked at the lamp, then at her, and there was a brief moment that was different from the other moments, quieter and more specific, before he looked at the table and said, "I'll let you get some sleep." She said, "Good night." She went to Clara's room, which had become her room in the gradual, unremarkable way rooms become yours when you've slept in them long enough. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the ranch at night, and thought about the East Field and the crops and the conversation, and then she thought about the moment with the lamp, and then she told herself firmly to go to sleep. The trouble came, as trouble in small towns tends to, from a direction she hadn't been watching. It wasn't Brant directly. It was his mother. Margaret Dillard was 60 years old, had lived in Red Mesa for 35 of them, and had spent most of those 35 years building the kind of social position that wasn't official, but was thoroughly real, the position of someone whose opinion of you determined which invitations you received and which conversations stopped when you entered them. She had not spoken directly to Lenora since the train station. She hadn't needed to. Her not speaking was itself a form of communication, and Red Mesa had been reading it clearly. Lenora found out about what Margaret Dillard had been saying from the most unexpected source, the woman in the mercantile who'd been performing not looking at her on that first supply trip. Her name was Doris Hale. She ran the town's small lending library, which was housed in the back room of her own house and funded by a system of small annual fees and the donations of anyone passing through who had books to spare. She was the kind of woman who initially appeared as a type small, precise conservative in dress and manner, and turned out to be considerably more than the type on closer inspection. She sought Lenora out on the 4th supply trip. Lenora was in the mercantile's side yard, checking the quality of a coil of rope Garrett was selling, when Doris Hale appeared at her elbow with the directness of someone who had decided on an action and was executing it before she could reconsider. "Miss Vance," she said, "I wonder if I might speak plainly." Lenora looked at her. "I prefer it." Doris looked briefly at the mercantile door closed and back. "Margaret Dillard has been suggesting to several households that your arrangement at Dry Willow Ranch is improper. The word she's using is," she paused, with the precision of someone quoting rather than characterizing, "convenient." Lenora kept her expression level. Meaning she's implying that you positioned yourself deliberately. That you took advantage of Rhett's illness to establish yourself in his household, with Doris's mouth compressed briefly, intentions beyond the domestic. The straightforward ugliness of it landed, not as a surprise she'd known something like this was coming, had known it in the way you know weather when you've been watching the sky. But knowing it was coming and hearing it stated plainly were different things. I see, she said. I'm telling you because I think you should know what's being said, Doris said. And because I watched you walk into this mercantile a month ago looking like a woman who expected to be dismissed and held yourself, as if you didn't intend to let that happen. And I thought, she stopped, seemed to assess how much of what she was thinking she was willing to say, and then said it anyway. I thought that was worth something. Whatever you're doing out at that ranch, I think it's worth more than she's making it sound. Lenora looked at her carefully. Why are you telling me this? You don't know me. No, Doris agreed, but I know Margaret Dillard, and I know the difference between a woman with a genuine moral concern and a woman who's protecting a story. She paused. The story she's protecting is the one where her son had a reasonable objection to a woman who turned out to be unsuitable. Your being at Dry Willow and doing something that appears to be working quite well is inconvenient for that story. Hence the word. Lenora almost smiled, didn't quite. Thank you, she said, for telling me directly. Doris nodded briskly. I thought you should have the information. Then she said, with the tentative quality of something added after the main point, the library has new books this month, if you're ever in town with time to spare. People have mentioned your work with medicinal plants. There's a volume. I'd like that, Lenora said, and meant it. She found Rhett at the wagon and told him what Doris had said, directly and without softening, because he was someone who could hear plainly delivered information, and she had no interest in managing what he knew about the situation he was in. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Margaret Dillard has been working on people's opinions in this town since before I was born, he said. He wasn't saying it with heat. He was saying it the way you describe a landscape. This is what it is. This is what you're dealing with. She's good at it. She doesn't usually need to do it this directly, which tells me she's more concerned than she's showing. Concerned about what, specifically? He looked at the street, the town moving around them in its ordinary business. Concerned that you're not going to go away, he said. You were supposed to be embarrassed enough to leave. You didn't leave. Now you're selling produce to Garrett, and Doris Hale is seeking you out in mercantile yards. He looked at her. You're becoming something harder to dismiss. That's not intentional. No, he said. That's why it works. She thought about that on the ride back. The ranch came into view ahead of them, and she looked at the fences, more repaired now than when she'd come, and the house with the shutters open the way she'd started leaving them in the mornings, and the garden that was producing well enough that she'd had to expand the shelf space in the larder to accommodate the jars. She thought about Brant Dillard's face in the mercantile, about Margaret Dillard working a room she wasn't in, about a story being protected, and what that story required of her. It required her to be diminished, to be either gone or kept small enough that the original version of events still held. She wasn't going to do that, not because she was trying to win something, not because she was building a case or planning a confrontation, but because she had too much work to do to make herself smaller. She had learned over the last 5 weeks that she was better at the work when she wasn't carrying the weight of someone else's story about her. Rhett, she said, yeah, the community social, the one Pruitt mentioned last week. He glanced at her. In 3 weeks, I think we should go. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him taking the full weight of what she was proposing, not just the social, but what going to it meant, what it would look like, what would happen when they walked in together. All right, he said. It's not going to be pleasant, she said. At least not at first, I know. Brant will be there. I know. She looked at the road. I'm not trying to fight anyone. She chose the words carefully. I'm tired of the story being told without me in the room. Rhett considered that for a long moment, the horse's steady rhythm underneath them, the dry land opening up ahead. You should be in the room, he said. You have been in the room every day, doing work that people in that town have been eating and using. They just haven't had to look at it directly. He kept his eyes on the road. Let's give them something to look at directly. She looked at him. He wasn't performing any particular feeling about this. He wasn't being gallant or dramatic. He was being what he was, a man who had assessed a situation and made a decision and was done discussing it. But something in the way he'd said, "Let's," the simple, unadorned plural of it, settled somewhere in her chest in a way she felt and didn't immediately name. She looked back at the road and said nothing and let the ranch get closer. The 2 weeks before the social were both ordinary and not. Ordinary because the work was the same: the garden, the animals, the fence sections that were still needing attention, the supply runs, the larder that was filling slowly and steadily with the evidence of what this land could produce when someone paid it proper attention. She and Rhett worked alongside each other in the way they'd established, speaking when there was something worth saying, and not speaking when there wasn't, which she had come to understand as a form of respect she hadn't known she wanted. Not ordinary because of what was building underneath all of it. The social was 3 weeks out, then 2, then 10 days, and the closer it got, the more she felt the particular weight of it, not dread, exactly. More like the feeling before something significant, where you know the outcome is not fully in your control, and you've decided to walk toward it anyway. She packed her trunk the night before. She didn't mean to. She was looking for a specific blouse she hadn't worn since arriving, something suitable for the social. And she pulled out the trunk from under the bed and found herself looking at the contents with the sudden vivid memory of the last time she'd packed it. St. Louis. 7 months of letters, a plan she'd trusted entirely. She sat on the edge of the bed with the trunk open and looked at everything she'd brought to Arizona with her: the practical clothes, her grandmother's book, the sewing supplies. 3 letters from Brant Dillard that she hadn't looked at since she'd arrived and hadn't thrown away either, which probably said something about her she wasn't ready to fully examine. She took the letters out. She thought about reading them. Thought about what they would say, the measured, practical language of a man describing what he needed in a way that had sounded like respect and turned out to have a condition she hadn't known about. She held them for a moment. Then she folded them and put them at the very bottom of the trunk, under everything else, and covered them and closed the lid. She found the blouse. She pressed it as best she could with what she had available. She hung it on the peg by the door and looked at it in the lamplight. She was not the person who had packed this trunk in St. Louis. She wasn't sure she could articulate yet exactly who she was instead, but she knew the distance between those 2 versions of herself was not the 1,000 miles she'd traveled. It was something larger and less cartographic. She blew out the lamp. Outside, the ranch was quiet in the way it got at this hour, not silent, because there was always something moving out there. The animals settling, the dry grass doing whatever it did in the night wind, the particular sound of wooden structures adjusting to the change in temperature. She'd learned to hear it as evidence of life rather than emptiness. She lay in the dark and thought about walking into that social. She thought about the room going quiet. She thought about Brant Dillard's face and Margaret Dillard's careful work and the accumulated social machinery of a town that had already made up its mind about her. She thought about Rhett saying, "Let's." She thought about 40 feet of fence and jars on a larder shelf and 2 plants that everyone else had given up on coming back because they were, apparently, more stubborn than the situation they were in. She closed her eyes. She had 3 days. She intended to use them. The morning of the social, Lenora woke before dawn and lay still for a long moment listening to the ranch. It had become a habit without her deciding to make it one those first few minutes of consciousness before she moved, just listening to what the day sounded like before it started asking things of her. The animals shifting, the particular silence that preceded the birds. The way the wood of the house spoke differently in the cool of early morning than it did by afternoon when the heat had worked into it. She'd learned the ranch's sounds the way you learned a person's habits gradually, without intending to, until one day you realized you knew them well enough to notice when something was different. This morning, everything sounded the same. That was either reassuring or irrelevant, because what was going to be different today had nothing to do with the ranch. She got up. She built the fire and put water on and went through the morning's necessary work, the animals, the garden check, the small inventory of what needed doing before she allowed herself to think about the evening. That was deliberate. She'd learned in the last weeks that the most reliable way to manage the kind of anxiety that had a specific future event at its center was to fill the present with things that were concrete and completable. A fed animal was a fed animal. A watered row was a watered row. These things didn't care what was happening that night. By mid-morning, the essential work was done, and the remaining hours before they needed to leave had a different quality, slower, more aware of themselves. Rhett was at the barn when she came back from the garden. He was doing something with a piece of tack that didn't strictly need doing today, and she recognized the activity for what it was, a man keeping his hands occupied while his mind was somewhere else. She didn't comment on it. She went inside and started heating water for washing and laid out the pressed blouse she'd hung by the door 3 days ago and looked at herself in the small mirror that lived above the washstand. She wasn't someone who spent a great deal of time in front of mirrors. It wasn't false modesty she knew what she looked like. Had known it long enough to be neither vain about the better parts of it nor distressed by the rest. But she looked now with a kind of inventory attention, trying to see what the room would see tonight when she walked in. Dark hair, which she could manage neatly, a face that looked more like the territory than it had 2 months ago Sun had found her, the way it found everyone who spent real time outdoors in Arizona. The blouse was good, plain but well made. She had one skirt that was appropriate for something social without being inappropriate for someone in her actual circumstances. She thought about Margaret Dillard's careful wardrobe, about the women who attended these events, who had lives that allowed for attention to appearance in ways hers didn't. Then she thought about the garden and the fence and the jars in the larder and the conversation with Doris Hale in the mercantile yard. She started doing her hair. Rhett came in at 2 in the afternoon and cleaned up with the efficiency of a man who did not linger over the process. He appeared in the main room 20 minutes later in a shirt she hadn't seen before, newer than most of what he wore, dark blue, the kind of thing a man kept for specific occasions, and he'd done something to his hair that made him look less like the person who spent his days repairing fence lines and more like the person he would have been if the last 3 years had gone differently. She was sitting at the table finishing the second cup of coffee that was definitely one more than she needed, and she looked at him and then away and then back because looking once hadn't quite been enough to finish the thought. He looked at her. He started, and then stopped, and she watched him encounter the limits of his own vocabulary in real time, which she found unexpectedly endearing. "Good," he said. "You look good." "Thank you," she said. "So do you." They stood in the kitchen for a moment, with the particular awkwardness of 2 people who had been living and working in close proximity for nearly 2 months and had developed a complete and functional shorthand for almost every practical situation, and were currently finding that practical shorthand insufficient for this specific moment. "We should go," she said. "Yes," he said, and they went. The social was held in the community hall at the center of Red Mesa, a large, low-ceilinged building that served as the town's primary gathering space and smelled, on entering, like decades of exactly these kinds of evenings compressed into the wood of the walls. Lanterns were hung at intervals. Tables along one side held food contributed by various households. A 3-piece group was setting up in the far corner with the slightly chaotic energy of musicians who were good enough, but hadn't quite finished deciding what they were going to play first. The wagon was not the only one in the yard when they arrived, which meant they would not be walking into an empty room. This was both better and worse than walking into an empty room. Better, because an empty room had a particular kind of exposure that a crowded one didn't. Worse, because a crowded room had an audience. Rhett set the brake. He climbed down and came around for her, and she took his offered hand for the step and felt the steadiness of it, not performative, not reassuring in the way of someone trying to reassure, just actually steady, and she held it for the moment she needed it and let go. They walked toward the hall entrance together. She was aware of her leg in the way she was always aware of it in new situations with new terrain, the slight adjustment at the entrance step, the recalibration once she was on the level floor inside. She didn't alter her pace. She didn't look down. The room noticed them. It didn't stop, not entirely. Not immediately, but there was a perceptible shift in the social weather, the kind you felt rather than heard. Conversations losing about 15% of their volume, attention redistributing itself toward the door with the practiced casualness of people trying to look like they weren't looking. Lenora looked at the room. The room, in whatever degree it permitted itself, looked back. She saw Doris Hale near the food table, who caught her eye and gave her a small nod that said several things at once. She saw Wallace Pruitt across the room with his wife, a tall woman with an angular face and an expression of someone who had already been briefed and had formed an opinion. She saw Garrett, the mercantile owner, in conversation with another man, who paused, and then she registered this, continued the conversation without making anything of the interruption. She saw Margaret Dillard near the far wall, speaking to two women whose posture indicated they were listening with the particular attention of people who understood whose company was worth keeping in Red Mesa. Margaret Dillard was 60 years old and small, and dressed in the way of someone who had decided that elegance was worth whatever it cost, and she had the kind of face that had probably been handsome once, and had since become something more formidable than handsome. She looked at Lenora the way a person looks at a problem they have underestimated and are now reassessing. Lenora held her gaze for a moment. Then she looked away, not because she was backing down, but because she had come here for the whole room, not just for Margaret Dillard. "There's Pruitt," Rhett said quietly. "I need to talk to him about the fall sale arrangement." "Will you be all right for a few minutes?" "I'll be fine," she said. "Go," he went. She moved toward the food table. Not because she needed food, but because food tables were the most socially neutral territory in any gathering room. People were always moving toward them, always stopping near them. And being near one gave you a reason to be standing still that wasn't about waiting for someone to talk to you. Doris Hale materialized beside her with the quiet efficiency of a small woman who knew how to move through a crowd. "You came," she said. "I said I would. People say things." Doris picked up a small plate and considered it. "Margaret noticed I saw she's been talking all week. About impropriety, about Rhett's reputation." Doris added something to her plate with precise movements. "About you specifically, knowing how to identify a vulnerable situation." The particular phrasing of that landed with a cold clarity. Knowing how to identify a vulnerable situation. It was good. In the way that effective attacks were good, it took the actual sequence of events, which was that she had walked 6 miles to help a dying man for reasons that had nothing to do with calculation, and reframed it as predatory intelligence. "She's effective," Lenora said, without particular heat. "She's very effective," Doris agreed. "She's also wrong. And the difference matters tonight more than it usually would, because you're here, and she didn't expect you to be. And people who didn't expect you to be here are going to spend the evening deciding what to think." "What do you think they'll decide?" Doris looked at her with direct, unsentimental eyes. "I think it depends on what happens in the next 2 hours," she said. "Which is why I'm standing next to you instead of over there." She tipped her head slightly toward the section of room where Margaret Dillard's orbit continued its work. Lenora looked at her. "You're taking a position." "I've been taking positions my whole life," Doris said. "I just usually do it through lending books." A brief dry pause. "Tonight I'm doing it through appetizers." Lenora almost laughed. Actually almost laughed, which was unexpected enough that she had to manage it. And something in the managing of it, the expression that was clearly the suppressed version of the real one, made Doris look satisfied in a small, private way. The first hour was a process of calibration. She talked to people. Not everyone. She wasn't performing, wasn't working the room in the way of someone with a strategy. But she was present, and she was approachable, and when people spoke to her, she gave them the full version of her attention, which she'd been told her whole life was something you could feel the presence or absence of. The station master's wife introduced herself. The station master had apparently told his wife about what he'd seen on the platform 2 months ago, because there was a quality of particular care in how the woman spoke to Lenora, something that wanted to apologize without quite having the words. Lenora made it easy for her. She didn't need the apology. She needed the conversation. A ranching family from the north side of the district asked her about the garden, specifically about what she was doing with the soil. They'd had trouble with the same dry conditions, and they'd heard through Garrett, apparently, through the produce sales that Dry Willow was producing well. She told them what she knew, the specific things, without making it into a lesson or a performance. Just, this worked. This didn't. Here's why I think that is. The husband listened with the focus of a man taking notes in his head. His wife asked a follow-up question that was more detailed than the husband's and took the answer and did something immediately, in the way of a person whose mind was already 3 steps ahead. She was in the middle of explaining the second barrel system to the ranching family when she became aware that the temperature of the room had shifted. She looked up. Brant Dillard had arrived. He came in with the ease of a man entering a space that had always belonged to him, which Red Mesa had for most of his adult life. He was not alone. There were 2 other men with him, ranchers from what she could tell, the kind of company that formed around a certain type of presence out of habit. He moved into the room and began doing what he did, which was working it, acknowledging people. Landing comments that she could see from across the room were landing well laughter in one cluster, pleased expression in another. He saw her. She saw him see her. The ease in his expression changed by about 3 degrees. Not much. Enough to be readable if you were looking. She went back to the conversation about the barrel system. Rhett appeared at her side 10 minutes later, having extracted himself from Pruitt's corner, where she'd been able to see them in close conversation for the better part of an hour. He stood next to her in the way he'd come to stand next to her when they were working not in front, not behind, just adjacent, equally present. "Brant's here," she said quietly. "I know," he said. Pruitt flagged it, and nothing yet. He looked across the room with the level attention he gave to things he was watching carefully. He's working his way around. He'll get here eventually. "I know. I want you to know something before he does," Rhett said. He said it the way he said things that mattered to him, which was without preamble and without the softening language that could make important things sound less important. Whatever he says tonight, whatever shape it takes, I'm not going to let it sit. I want to be clear about that. She looked at him. What does that mean? Specifically, it means he's been shaping what this town thinks for 2 months, with no one telling the other side of it. Tonight, I'm going to tell the other side of it. She was quiet for a moment. "Rhett, you don't need to fight for me. I know I don't need to," he said. "I want to. There's a difference." She looked at the room, at the conversations happening, at Margaret Dillard's group, at Brant moving through the space with practiced social ease. She looked at Rhett, who was watching the same things with an expression that was not angry, not heated, but absolutely certain. "All right," she said. Brant reached them at the 40-minute mark, which she thought said something about his instincts. He'd waited long enough that it didn't look like he'd come directly, but not so long that it looked like he was avoiding them. He stopped in front of them with the air of someone encountering a mildly interesting coincidence. "Rhett," he said, the acknowledgement of a man to another man who exists in the same professional space. Then, with the fractional pause that did the work, "Miss Vance." "Dillard," Rhett said. Flat. No return social warmth, no hostility, just the bare fact of the name. Brant looked between them with an expression that was practiced into openness. "Good to see Dry Willow's back on its feet. Heard you've been doing well out there." He was speaking to Rhett, but his eyes moved to Lenora, and there was something in that movement, the inclusion of her in the sentence while addressing him, that was designed. Lucky thing. Having someone turn up when you needed help. "Lucky," Rhett said. The single word landed without inflection. Brant heard the absence of agreement in it and chose to move past it. "I was sorry to hear about the infection," he said. "Something like that can go bad fast." Another look at Lenora, brief and pointed. Fortunate timing. For everyone, I suppose. The "for everyone" was the thing. She heard it do what it was designed to do, insert the implication of mutual benefit, of arrangement, of something calculated underneath the surface of what had happened. She felt the people in the immediate vicinity register it. She saw Doris Hale nearby go very still. Rhett said, "Can I ask you something, Brant?" The shift in his voice was minimal, but it was there. Something that had been observational became something else. Brant opened his hand slightly, a gesture of open invitation. Sure. When you left that station platform, Rhett said, what was it, exactly, that you decided you'd seen? The room nearest to them went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something real is happening. Brant's expression stayed on the surface of the casual. I'm not asking for the room's benefit, Rhett said. I'm asking you directly. What did you see in 30 seconds that told you she wasn't worth a conversation? Brant's jaw tightened fractionally. Rhett, I don't think this is the time or the place. She walked 1,000 miles on a plan you made with her, Rhett said. The casualness was entirely gone now. He wasn't raising his voice, he didn't need to. The room was doing its own work, attending without being asked. She got off a train in a state she'd never been to, carrying everything she owned, ready to make a life on your word. And you looked at the way she walked, and you got in your wagon. That's a simplification of, she walked 6 miles, Rhett said, through desert heat, with a leg that's been difficult her whole life, to a ranch she'd never seen, to help a man she'd never met, because he was sick and there was no one else. He was not looking at the room. He was looking at Brant, directly and without any of the social softening that made difficult conversations easier to survive. She cleaned a wound that was 2 days from killing me. She sat up for 3 nights when it was bad. She rebuilt a kitchen and a garden and 40 feet of fence while I was still on my back. She did it because it needed doing, not because of what she'd get from it. The silence in the room had spread. It wasn't complete. This was a crowded social. It could never be completely silent, but the silence in their vicinity had a gravity that was pulling the attention of the wider room toward it. She preserved and sold produce that half this town has been eating for 6 weeks, Rhett continued. She learned the land in 8 weeks better than some people learn it in a decade. She did all of that, and here his voice changed slightly, not louder, but with the particular weight of a man saying the thing he actually means, with a limp you couldn't get past in 30 seconds. Brant said nothing. His face was doing complicated things. I don't judge people by how they walk, Rhett said. I judge them by what they do when things are hard. By that measure, she's the strongest person in this room. He paused. And you're a man who left a woman alone on a train platform without the courtesy of a single word. I don't know what measure you'd prefer to be judged by, but that's the one I've got. The silence held for a moment. Then the station master, who had been standing within hearing range, said, clearly and without particular drama, "He's right." I was there. Brant looked at the station master. He looked at the room, at the faces that were arranged around this moment, processing it, deciding where they were going to land. His mother was across the room. Even at the distance, Lenora could see that Margaret Dillard was watching her son with an expression she was working hard to control. Brant looked at Lenora. She met his eyes. She had been waiting for the feeling that was supposed to come with this moment, the vindication, the satisfaction, some clean and resolving emotion that paid back what had happened on that platform. But what she actually felt was quieter than that and more complex. She felt the past 2 months settle around her like something that had always been going to happen, the way the solution to a problem looks obvious once you've found it. She felt not triumph, something steadier than triumph. Something that had less to do with Brant Dillard than she'd expected. Brant turned away from her. He spoke to the man beside him in the lowered voice of someone extracting himself from a situation, and the man responded with the careful neutrality of someone trying to find the right side of a thing that was still in process. He left shortly after. The hour that followed was different. Not transformed, she wasn't naive enough to think that one conversation, even one that had gone the way that one went, transformed a room permanently. People's long-held opinions didn't reverse course completely in an evening. But something had shifted in the available space, the way furniture shifted. When a large piece was removed, what had been organized around it had to find a new arrangement. The ranching wife who'd asked the detailed question about the garden soil came back and introduced her husband more formally and said they'd like to visit Dry Willow sometime to look at what she'd done with the east plot, if that was acceptable. Wallace Pruitt crossed the room with his wife. and the wife, whose name was Beth, and who had the angular face and direct eyes of someone who made decisions clearly, said that she'd been planning to call on Lenora at the ranch and had been waiting for the right occasion. She said it in the tone of someone who had already decided the occasion was now. Garrett, passing with a plate, stopped and said with the awkwardness of a man who hadn't said the thing when he should have and was correcting that. Should have offered you that counter position when you first came in. I want you to know I'm aware of that. She looked at him. What position? She asked, not unkindly. He looked slightly relieved that she hadn't pressed the specifics of it. Come by the store next week, he said. I'd like to talk about a more formal arrangement for the produce. A more formal arrangement, she held that quietly. Doris Hale found her after Garrett moved on and stood beside her with an expression that was as close to satisfied as Doris Hale's face apparently got, which was not very close, but was visible to someone who'd been paying attention. Well, Doris said. Well, Lenora agreed. He said it plainly. He did. I didn't know he had that in him, Doris said. Rhett's been quiet for years, since Clara. She looked across the room to where Rhett was in conversation with Pruitt's wife and two other people she didn't know. He used to be different before she died, more present. He went inward after. She was quiet for a moment. He doesn't look inward tonight, Lenora followed her gaze. Rhett was actually talking. Not the careful, minimal speech of a man managing his own company, but talking the way people talked when they were engaged, when something had come back online that had been off. One of the people in the group said something and he responded, and the response produced laughter, and she saw him receive it with the slightly surprised quality of someone who had forgotten he could do that. She thought about a man who had said a name in a fever, Clara, urgent, like a warning that couldn't reach, and who had gone quiet in his own house for 3 years, and let the garden die, and the fences fall, and the kitchen accumulate the evidence of a person who was only barely managing to exist. She thought about the first morning he'd woken up in his right mind and looked at his own kitchen, clean, and run his hand across the table. She thought about 40 feet of fence and 2 stubborn plants and a conversation about the east field that had run 2 hours without either of them noticing. He's going to be all right, Lenora said quietly. She wasn't sure if she meant tonight specifically or in general, and she thought maybe both, and she thought that was sufficient. Doris made a sound of agreement that didn't require elaboration. Across the room, the 3-piece group had started playing something not the tentative setup sounds of before, but actual music. A tempo that was slow enough for people who were talking and fast enough for anyone who felt like moving. A few couples had moved toward the open space at the room's center. The social had found its footing after the disruption of the last hour and was doing what socials did, which was continuing. Rhett found her 20 minutes later. He came and stood beside her, and she could feel the difference in him compared to when they'd arrived. Some layer of tension that had been there all day was gone, replaced by something that was either exhaustion or relief or both. He stood with the loose, quieter posture of a man who has said the thing he needed to say and is now on the other side of it. Pruitt says the cattle buyer is coming the 2nd week of October, he said. Good news, she said. Beth Pruitt wants to visit the ranch. She told me. I said yes. He looked at the room. How are you doing? She considered the question. It was the kind of question that could take a short answer or a long one, and she thought about which one was true and found that they both were. Better than I expected, she said, and tired. He looked at her then, not the quick glance of a man making a polite check, but the longer, more specific look of someone paying genuine attention to a person they actually see. She held it. She had learned that his attention was not the uncomfortable kind, not the assessing kind she'd felt in various forms since arriving in Arizona. It was the kind that felt like being registered, like being actually present to someone rather than observed by them. Thank you, she said, for what you said. I said what was accurate, he said. You always say that. When you say something kind, you say it's accurate. Something moved in his face, because it is. That's not the only reason something's worth saying, she said. He looked at her for a moment. She saw him consider this with the care he brought to things he was thinking through properly. No, he said finally, it's not. The music had shifted into something slower. Around them, the room continued its business conversations and laughter, and the social machinery of a community that was, for the moment, something she was a part of rather than a subject of. It wasn't complete. She wasn't naive about Red Mesa, about what Margaret Dillard would do with this evening, about the work that was still ahead. But the room felt different than it had when she'd walked in. She felt different than she had when she'd walked in. "Will you dance?" Rhett said. She looked at him. He was asking the way he asked things that mattered to him plainly, without elaborate framing, just the direct request with nothing around it to hide in if she said no. She was aware of the room. She was aware of what it would see her particular gait, the rhythm she'd made peace with over 20 years, the thing one man had used as a reason to leave her, and that she had never once, not for a single day of her life, been able to hide. She was aware that Rhett Calder knew all of that and had said yes to it before she'd said a word. "Yes," she said. They moved to the floor together. She put her hand in his, and his hand went to her waist with the same steadiness that had been in his hand at the wagon step, not reassuring, not careful, just actually steady. And they found the tempo together, the way you found your footing on new terrain, with some adjustment, and then with something that felt natural. She crossed the floor with the same step she'd always had. She made no adjustment for the room. She made no apology in her posture or her movement or the set of her shoulders. The room saw what it saw, and what the room saw was a woman who had come to Red Mesa 2 months ago with everything she owned and a plan that collapsed on the platform and had built something out of what was left. Who had walked 6 miles through desert heat and sat up through 3 dangerous nights and coaxed a dying garden back and repaired 40 feet of fence and filled a larder with the evidence of what this land could do when someone paid it proper attention. Who danced now with her chin up and her step unchanged, beside a man who had been going quiet in his own house for 3 years and had found something worth being present for. Across the room, Margaret Dillard watched. Brant Dillard's wagon was no longer in the yard. The music continued. Lenora kept moving forward, the same way she always had, the same way she always would, with the step that had always been hers, in the direction she had chosen herself. The ride home from the social was quiet in the way that follows something significant, not uncomfortable, not empty, but the kind of quiet that has weight to it, that carries the evening inside it like a thing still being processed. The stars were out in the particular abundance that Arizona nights produced, the kind of sky that a person from a city might find almost aggressive in its scale, but that Lenora had come to think of over the past 2 months as simply honest. No softening, no limits on the view, just the full truth of how large the thing above you actually was. She sat beside Rhett on the wagon bench and let the sound of the horse and the creak of the wheels do the work of filling the silence. And she thought about the evening in the way you thought about something while it was still warm, not analyzing it yet, just holding it and feeling its shape. He spoke first eventually. "You doing all right?" "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true and he'd earned the true version, "Better than all right, I think. Though I won't know the full extent of it until tomorrow." "Why tomorrow?" "Because tonight everything has a certain quality that comes from adrenaline," she said. "Tomorrow I'll feel what's actually underneath it." He considered this. "And what do you think will be underneath it?" She thought about Brant's face after Rhett had said what he'd said. About the station master's voice from the edge of the crowd, flat and clear. "I was there." About dancing on that floor with her unaltered step while the room reorganized its understanding of who she was. "Relief," she said. "I think mostly relief." Rhett nodded. He drove. The ranch came into view ahead, the dark shape of it against the slightly lighter dark of the sky, and she saw the outline of the house and the barn and the garden fence, and felt the thing she'd been feeling increasingly for weeks, the thing she still didn't have a perfect word for, which was the sensation of returning to somewhere that was hers. "It's not over," she said. "Margaret Dillard. She won't let one evening change everything she's been building." "No," he agreed. "She'll regroup. She'll find a new approach." "Probably. That doesn't bother you." He pulled the wagon into the yard and set the brake and sat for a moment before answering. "It bothers me the way weather bothers me," he said. "It's a real thing that requires real attention. But I don't lose sleep over weather I can't control. I just stay ready for it. She looked at him in the darkness. That's either very wise or very exhausting. Some days it's both, he said. She almost laughed. Did a little, quietly, and he turned to look at her with an expression she couldn't quite read in the dark, but that felt warm in its direction. They unhitched the horse and got the animals settled and went inside, and the house received them the way it always did now, with the specific character of a place that had been inhabited by people who took care of it. She hung up her good blouse and put the kettle on, because the night had a chill and tea was the last simple thing she wanted before sleep. And Rhett sat at the table and took off his good hat and set it on the chair beside him and ran a hand through his hair. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "The letters," he said. "From Brant. Before you came out here, you told me once that you'd corresponded for 7 months. She poured the water. "That's right. Did he in those letters, did he seem like the person he turned out to be? Or was it a surprise?" She brought 2 cups to the table and sat down across from him. It was a question she'd thought about. A question she'd turned over more than once in the small hours of nights when the ranch was quiet and she had nothing but her own thoughts for company. Both, she said honestly. He was consistent in the letters. "Practical," he said what he meant, or I thought he did. He said my leg didn't concern him. I believed it because he'd said it directly, and people who say things directly, she paused. I tend to trust them. It's a failing sometimes. The directness was real. But there was something underneath it that the letters couldn't show me, which was what he actually did when theory became reality. Rhett was watching her with his thinking expression. "He believed what he wrote," she said, "right up until he saw me walk. And then what he actually felt turned out to be stronger than what he believed about himself." She looked at the tea. "I've stopped being angry at him for what he thought. I'm still angry at him for the silence, for not having the basic decency to say a single word to me." "That's the part worth being angry about," Rhett said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, then. "For what it's worth, I don't think you should stop trusting directness. I think you should keep trusting it. Just also watch what people do with the small things. Before the big test comes." She looked at him. "Is that what you did? Watch the small things?" Something shifted in his expression, careful, honest. "I watched you with the animals," he said. "The first week. When you thought I was sleeping, you talked to them." She felt a small, involuntary warmth in her face. "I do that." "I know. You told the old mare she was doing fine and that her water was coming." He paused. "You could have not bothered. No one was watching. The mare wasn't going to tell anyone. You still talked to her." She looked at him. "Small things," he said simply. She held that for a moment. The tea was cooling between her hands, and the lamp on the table was burning steadily, and outside the ranch was quiet, and she was sitting across from a man who had watched her talk to a horse in her first week and filed it as something important. "You should sleep," she said, because it was late and because the moment had gotten to a size where she needed to step back from it slightly. Not from fear, but from the instinct of a woman who had learned not to rush the things that mattered. "I should," he agreed. They said good night. She went to Clara's room, her room. She corrected herself. It was hers now, in every way that mattered, and lay in the dark, and listened to the ranch, and thought about small things, and about what they meant, and about a man who had decided she was worth trusting because of how she behaved when no one was paying attention. She fell asleep with something in her chest that felt carefully and without excessive announcement like happiness. October arrived with a change in the air that wasn't dramatic, but was real, a degree or two of coolness in the mornings, the quality of the light shifting toward something less punishing, the dry landscape looking slightly different under a sky that was starting to consider the possibility of clouds. Cattle buyer came on a Wednesday. His name was Frederick Moss, and he arrived in a good wagon with a business coat that looked wrong against the Arizona landscape, but was clearly his professional armor. A man who understood that how you looked when you walked into a negotiation said something you wanted, said before words started. He was methodical, not unpleasant, and he looked at the Dry Willow herd with the attention of someone who was actually assessing rather than performing assessment. Rhett showed him the cattle. Lenora stayed at the house because it was Rhett's negotiation, and she understood the difference between being present for something and inserting herself into it. But she watched from the garden, where she was doing the late-season work of preserving what could be preserved and pulling what needed to come out. The conversation in the yard was too far away to hear. She watched it in gestures and postures, Moss, pointing at various animals, Rhett responding, both of them doing the particular physical calculation of men who negotiate by standing near the thing being negotiated about. It went for nearly an hour. When Moss drove away and Rhett came back to the garden, she looked at his face first, because his face was more reliable than his initial report. His face looked like a man who had gotten a result he hadn't been entirely sure he'd get. "Well," she said. "Better than last year's price," he said. "Better than I was expecting from Pruitt's estimate." She waited. "Enough to clear the primary debt," he said. With some left over, she set down what she was holding. "All of it?" "The primary debt entirely, all of it." She stood in the garden for a moment with that information, feeling what it actually meant, not just the abstract fact of the money, but what it represented. The ranch without that weight. Dry Willow Ranch owned cleanly, without the shadow of what was owed hanging over every decision about what could be spent and what couldn't be risked. "Rhett," she said. "I know," he said. "I know." And he smiled then fully. The real version, the one that she had seen in partial forms over the past months, but rarely like this, unreserved and genuine, and changing his whole face into something years younger than it usually looked. She stood in the garden and watched it, and felt something large move through her chest. She smiled back. It was not a small moment, what happened in that garden. Two people standing in dry Arizona soil in October, with the evidence of what they'd built around them, the recovered plants, the organized beds, the fences visible in the distance, the house that smelled like a home again, and one of them grinning like a man who had just come back to himself fully for the first time in 3 years, and the other looking at him and understanding, in a way that bypassed language entirely, exactly what this meant. The formal arrangement with Garrett came through in November. She went to the Mercantile on the first Tuesday of the month as they'd agreed, and they sat in the back room where he kept his accounts and talked numbers. He wanted a regular supply of preserved goods the relish had continued selling, and a pickled beet she'd added in September had moved faster than anything he'd stocked in recent memory, which told her something about what Red Mesa was hungry for that the market hadn't been providing. He wanted a weekly delivery through the winter months, fixed price, with flexibility on specific products based on what the season was doing. It was not a large income, but it was consistent income, which was different, and in some ways more valuable. Consistent meant she could plan around it. Consistent meant Dry Willow had a revenue stream that wasn't dependent on the single annual cattle sale. She shook Garrett's hand and walked out of the Mercantile into the November morning and stood on the main street of Red Mesa for a moment, looking at it. She had walked into this town 4 months ago with $11 and a collapsed plan and the particular exposure of a person who has been publicly discarded. The town had not been kind to her, not initially. It had done what small towns did with situations that made them uncomfortable. It had looked away and spoken around the edges and made her understand, in the small accumulated ways that didn't require a single direct word, that she was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be known. And now she was standing outside the Mercantile with a supply contract, and she was about to walk to the lending library, because Doris Hale had sent a note saying the new medical volumes she'd requested through the interdistrict lending system had arrived, and on the way she'd stop at Mrs. Ferris's boarding house because Beth Pruitt had organized a small monthly gathering of women from the surrounding ranches to share practical information, seed sources, preservation techniques, the kind of knowledge that didn't get written down anywhere official, but that people needed, and Mrs. Ferris was hosting, and Lenora had been asked to come and talk about the dry soil gardening work. She thought about the woman who had sat on a hotel bed 4 months ago and counted $11. The distance between that woman and this moment was not the money. It was not the contract. It was not even the garden or the fence or the cattle sale. It was the fact that she had stopped waiting for someone to see her and had simply gone about being someone worth seeing. She walked to the lending library. Margaret Dillard did not disappear after the social. Lenora had expected she wouldn't. What happened instead was more gradual and in some ways more interesting than a direct confrontation would have been. Margaret continued her work. Lenora heard about it in the indirect ways she heard most things, through Doris and through Beth Pruitt, who had a clear-eyed view of Red Mesa's social mechanics. Margaret had recalibrated after the social. The impropriety angle had been damaged by Rhett's public account of what Lenora had actually done in those first weeks, and the station master's corroboration had removed the possibility of attributing the account to bias. So Margaret shifted. The new angle was quieter and in some ways more sophisticated. Not that Lenora was improper, but that she was temporary. An arrangement of convenience that would end, probably badly for Rhett, once circumstances changed. It was clever. It seeded doubt without requiring any specific accusation that could be directly rebutted. Lenora heard about it and sat with it for a day and then went and talked to Rhett. She didn't approach it with alarm. She'd learned by now that the way you presented a problem to Rhett determined a great deal about the quality of thinking you'd get back from him, and she'd found that plain presentation produced the best results. Margaret Dillard's revised position, she said, is that this is temporary, that I'll leave eventually. She's planting that seed around town. Rhett was sharpening a tool at the workbench, and he continued doing it for a moment before he set it down and turned around. What do you think about that? I think it's harder to rebut than the impropriety argument, she said, because it's about the future, which neither of us can prove anything about. What would you need to be able to rebut it? She looked at him. She had thought about this on the walk back from wherever she'd heard it last. She'd turned it over from different angles, the way she approached problems that didn't have obvious solutions. The honest answer was that there was only one thing that would definitively answer the argument that she was temporary, and that was to be permanent. And the only form permanent took, in the language Red Mesa understood, was the form that was also the thing she'd come to Arizona for in the first place, with a different man, under circumstances that had felt nothing like this. Rhett, she said carefully, I'm not telling you this because I'm asking for anything. I want you to understand that. I'm telling you because you should know what she's doing and why, and because you deserve to have the information. I know, he said. I understood that from the way you told it. He was quiet for a moment. He picked up the tool and set it down again without using it. He looked at the workbench, then at her. I've been thinking, he said, about something for a while. And I want to say it plainly, because I don't know how to say it any other way, and you deserve to hear it as the actual thing, not dressed up. She waited. I'm not going to ask you because of Margaret Dillard, he said. I want to be clear about that first. I'm not going to ask because of what the town thinks, or because it solves a problem, or because you need protecting, or because I owe you anything, even though you saved my life, and I'm aware of that every single day. He met her eyes. I want to ask because the last 4 months are the first 4 months in 3 years that this place has felt like somewhere worth being. And the difference, the only difference, is you. He had told her once that he wasn't good at asking for things. He'd said it the day he asked her to stay on at the ranch, and it had been honest and she'd appreciated the honesty. He was doing the same thing now, telling her the truth about his own limitations, and then doing the thing anyway, because he'd decided it was worth doing regardless. I'm not an easy man, he said. I know that. I go quiet when I'm troubled, and I don't always remember to say things that should be said, and I've let this place fall apart once already, and I can't promise it won't be hard. He stopped. But I'd rather build it with you than without you. That's the most honest thing I can tell you. The workshop was quiet around them. Outside, the wind was doing what November wind did, moving through the dry grass with a sound that was not music, but was close to music if you listened to it the right way. She thought about what she'd felt on that train coming into Red Mesa. The rehearsed first line, the hope she'd packed in alongside everything else in that trunk. She thought about the platform and the look and the wagon driving away. She thought about $11. She thought about a man on the floor of a house that had forgotten how to be a home, and 3 nights in a chair, and a garden coming back from the edge of dead, and a conversation about the East Field that went 2 hours without either of them noticing the time. She thought about him watching her talk to a horse. "You're not easy," she agreed. "Neither am I. I have opinions about how things should be done, and I'm not shy about them, and I've been known to push on things past the point where most people would stop. I get in my own way sometimes. I hold things too long before I let them go." He was watching her with the full level attention he gave to things he was taking seriously. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment, just to be sure he'd heard what he'd heard. "Yes," he repeated. "Yes," she said again with complete certainty. Something crossed his face that she didn't have a name for, not joy exactly, relief exactly. Something that was both of those things and something else underneath them, something older and less easily defined. The expression of a man who had been closed off for a long time, feeling the thing he'd been closed off from come back. He crossed the workshop, and she stood her ground the way she stood her ground at everything. And he put his hands on either side of her face with a care that was surprising for hands that had been doing rough work for most of their life. And he kissed her. It was not a practiced thing. It was not smooth or cinematic. It was the first kiss of two people who had been building trust for 4 months without naming what it was building toward. And it had in it all of that accumulated weight, the nights by the fire, the conversations about the East Field, the 40 feet of fence, the dance floor, everything. When they stepped back from it, they looked at each other, and she saw that he was slightly undone, in a way she had never seen Rhett Calder undone, and she suspected she looked about the same. "All right then," he said. "All right," she agreed. They married in February, when the worst of the winter had passed, and the land was doing the thing it did in the gap between cold and heat, a brief provisional green that didn't last, but was genuinely beautiful while it did. The ceremony was at the ranch, because neither of them had any particular attachment to the community hall, and because Dry Willow was the place where the actual story had happened, and it seemed right for the ending to happen there too. It was not a large wedding. That had been her preference, and he had immediately agreed, which told her something about him she already knew. Wallace and Beth Pruitt came. Doris Hale came and brought 3 books as a gift, which was so perfectly Doris that Lenora found herself laughing when she unwrapped them. A real laugh, the unguarded kind. Mrs. Ferris came and cried with the comfortable transparency of a woman who didn't see the point in pretending she wasn't moved. The ranching family from the north side came, the couple with the detailed questions about soil, and the wife brought preserves she'd made, using the techniques Lenora had shared at the monthly gathering, which felt like a kind of tribute. The station master came. She had not expected that. He arrived with his hat in his hands and stood slightly apart from the others, with the particular discomfort of a man who knows he's witnessing something he has complicated feelings about. And when she went to greet him, he looked at her with an expression that had 2 months of unspent contrition in it. "Should have done something," he said, that day. "Platform. I saw what happened, and I didn't. You helped me find lodging," she said. "That was something." He shook his head slightly, not accepting the reprieve that easily. It wasn't enough. "No," she agreed, because she was done softening things for people's comfort, including the station master's. "But you're here now." He nodded. He stayed for the whole afternoon. She noticed him talking to Rhett at one point, a conversation that appeared to end with a handshake, and she didn't ask what it was about because she understood it without asking. There was no representative from the Dillard family. That was also true and also fine. The news that Lenora Vance had married Rhett Calder traveled through Red Mesa, the way news traveled in Red Mesa, which was thoroughly and quickly. The response it produced was not uniform, it never was, in any collection of humans large enough to have diverse opinions, but the dominant response, from what she could observe in the weeks following, was something in the range of unsurprised acceptance. The ground had been prepared. The social in October had done what it had done. Supply contracts and the monthly gatherings and the simple accumulating fact of her continued presence had done the rest. Margaret Dillard said nothing public. Whatever she said in private, Lenora neither knew nor particularly cared to know. The theory about temporary arrangements had been answered in the most permanent language available, and Margaret Dillard was too intelligent not to understand when a position was no longer tenable. Brant Dillard had left Red Mesa in January. She heard this from Doris, who had heard it from Garrett, who had heard it from a source she couldn't identify and didn't claim to. He'd sold some property and moved to another district for reasons that were described as business-related, which may have been partly true and was certainly partly not. His departure was noted, and then, in the way of small towns with new things to talk about, largely moved past. Lenora did not think about him often. When she did, it was not with anger and not with satisfaction, not with the triumphant relief she might have predicted she'd feel if she'd known, back on that platform, how the story was going to go. What she felt was something quieter and more impersonal than any of those. Something like the feeling you had when you'd had a bad fall and healed from it and ran your fingers over the scar, not with grief for the injury and not with gratitude exactly, but with a certain recognition that the scar was part of the map of you now. It pointed somewhere. It told you something. He had seen how she walked and made a decision. And that decision had sent her to Dry Willow Ranch and everything that followed. And she could not, in any honest accounting of the last year, conclude that she would trade that sequence for an alternate version where he'd been kinder on the platform. She couldn't. The life she was living was built from the rubble of that moment. It was in every way she could measure the better life. Not easier. Not without its problems and its ongoing struggles, and the mornings when the work felt like too much, and the accounts were still tighter than comfort required, and Rhett went quiet in a way she recognized and knew. Would pass but still required patience in the waiting. Better. The East Field, the one they'd talked about that 2-hour evening in the lamplight, was planted in spring with a combination of drought-tolerant grain varieties that Lenora had researched through Doris's lending contacts, and Rhett had studied with the same focused attention he brought to anything he decided was worth understanding. The first season was partial. They hadn't expected the first season to be anything else. Farming new soil with new methods in a climate that didn't forgive errors was a process that unfolded over years, not months. She knew this. She told him this on the days when the progress was invisible and the effort felt like it was going into the ground without returning anything. "I know," he said. "I'm not expecting overnight." "Good," she said. "Because it won't be. Were you worried I thought it would be?" "A little." He looked at her, with the expression she still found she had to actively manage not to show too much of a response to the one that was fully attentive in the way of someone who was genuinely tracking what, she said, and not just waiting for his turn to talk. "I've been working this land for 15 years, he said. "I know how it thinks. The land doesn't think. You talk to horses," he said. She pointed at him. "That's different, is it?" She walked away from that conversation before he could see her smiling at it, because she was still, after months of marriage, navigating the particular situation of being with a man who made her laugh in ways she hadn't expected and who seemed to find her reciprocal humor genuinely gratifying, and she hadn't quite gotten used to it yet. She thought she might be getting used to it for a long time. By midsummer, the East Field had 2 rows that were doing something real. Not abundant, not the full picture of what she thought the field could eventually become, but real plants that were putting down roots in soil that had been dead ground, that were establishing themselves in the way of things that intended to stay. She stood at the edge of the field in July heat with a water cup and looked at those rows and thought about an evening 5 months ago in a workshop and a proposal that had included the phrase, "I'm not an easy man," and a first kiss that had been real and imperfect and therefore right. She thought about her grandmother's book, still on the shelf in what was now fully and permanently her kitchen, the first page still readable, make do. Move forward, cry later if you need to. She thought about the trunk under the bed and the letters at the bottom of it. She hadn't looked at them since the night before the social. She didn't need to. She thought about a woman who had arrived in Arizona with a plan for a life and found instead the actual life, which was harder and more uncertain and more genuinely hers than the plan had ever been. People traveled through the East Road and looked at Dry Willow Ranch as they passed. There was more to see now than there had been a year ago, the fences in real repair, the garden visible from the road in its ordered and productive sections, the house with smoke from the kitchen chimney and the shutters open, the evidence of a working place. Some of them knew the story. Some of them only saw what was in front of them, which was a ranch that was clearly being tended by someone who cared whether it survived. Both versions were true. That fall, in October, a year after the first cattle sale that had cleared the primary debt, the second sale produced a number that let them begin repairs on the barn that had been waiting since before Clara died. Rhett hired 2 men from the district for the work, and Lenora fed them at the kitchen table, and the kitchen, which had once smelled like sickness and neglect, smelled like coffee and food and the particular warmth of a room that was used. She listened to the men talking to Rhett about the barn work, and she sat at the table with her account ledger and her notes on the next season's planting, and she listened to the familiar sound of the ranch conducting its business. And she felt not triumph, not vindication, not any of the dramatic emotions that stories were supposed to end on. She felt present. She felt specifically, concretely, entirely present in her own life. That was not a small thing. She had spent years being present in other people's lives, her mother's illness, the household that needed managing, the 7 months of letters to a man who turned out to be corresponding with an idea rather than a person. She had spent a significant portion of her adult life existing in the service of arrangements that were not quite fully hers. This was hers. The kitchen and the garden and the east field and the man outside talking to the workers about roof joists and the trunk under the bed and the remedies on the shelf and the limp that had never once kept her from going where she needed to go. All of it was hers. Rhett came inside at midday and washed up at the basin and sat down at the table across from her the way he sat across from her every day, with the easy familiarity of people who had learned each other's rhythms and found them compatible. He looked at the ledger. "How are we doing?" he said. "Better than this time last year," she said. "Worse than I want us to be in 5 years." That's the right direction, though. It is. He poured himself coffee and looked out the window at the work happening on the barn. "You know what I've been thinking about?" he said. "The north pasture," she said, because he'd mentioned it twice in the last week. He looked at her. "How did you do this thing when you're thinking about a piece of land," she said. "You look at nothing for about 10 seconds, and then you look at the floor. You did it about the east field for a month before you said anything." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know I did that." "You do." He looked at the floor. She watched him do it and felt the warm, specific affection of someone who has learned a person thoroughly enough to know their tells, which was a kind of knowledge that was also a kind of love. "Tell me about the north pasture," she said. He told her. She listened. She asked questions that pushed the thinking further, the way she'd found she could do with him, not challenging for the sake of it, but genuinely probing, because the ideas got better when they were pushed. He responded to the probing the way he responded to most things she brought to him, which was by taking it seriously and following it where it went. They talked through lunch. The workers outside continued their work. The barn was getting its roof back. The kitchen was producing 3 times what it had the year before. The east field was coming, slowly and stubbornly, into itself. Outside, the October sky over Arizona was the particular shade of blue that it only got in the fall, deep and clear and without limit in any direction. Lenora Vance had walked into Red Mesa 14 months ago with $11 and a collapsed plan and the particular vulnerability of a person who has trusted the wrong thing. She had walked in with a limp she'd had her whole life, the same limp one man had seen as a reason to leave, and another had seen as evidence of someone who kept going regardless. She walked still, always with the same step, always with the same uneven rhythm that had marked her since childhood, that no amount of practice or pride or pain had ever fully corrected, and that she had spent years managing other people's discomfort about. She did not manage it anymore. She let it be what it was, which was hers, part of the complete and specific and imperfect person she'd always been. The person who had needed to travel 1,000 miles to a dry and unforgiving place to finally have the space to be that person without apology. Brant Dillard had seen how she walked and made a calculation. Rhett Calder had watched her walk toward a dying man's house from 6 miles away and understood that what he was looking at was not a limitation. The difference between those two readings of the same woman was not a small difference. It was not a matter of kindness versus unkindness or generosity versus judgment. It was something more fundamental than that. It was the difference between a person who looked at someone and saw the thing they couldn't do, and a person who looked at someone and saw what they were already doing regardless. Lenora knew which one she was, and she had spent her whole life being it. She had kept moving forward through every situation that should have stopped her the fever, the childhood, her mother's illness, the train station, the hotel room, the 6 miles in desert heat, not because she was exceptional, not because she was without fear or doubt, or the very ordinary human wish that things could be easier, but because stopping had never felt like a real option. Because the woman her grandmother had raised did not know how to be still in the face of a problem. She thought sometimes, late at night when the ranch was quiet and Rhett was sleeping with the solid, unconscious presence of a man who had learned to trust his own life again, about what she would tell the woman on that train platform if she could. The woman sitting rigid with her rehearsed first line, trusting a plan that was about to fail. She would not tell her it was going to be fine. She would not tell her the fall was worth it, or that everything happened for a reason, or any of the comfortable things people said to paper over the genuine difficulty of hard experiences. She would tell her, keep your grandmother's book. Keep the practical skills and the stubbornness and the capacity to sit through difficult nights without losing your nerve. Keep the directness, even when it costs you. Don't mistake silence for depth in a person who owes you words. And when you walk off that platform into an Arizona town that doesn't know what to do with you, walk the way you always walk. Don't adjust it. Don't soften it for anyone's comfort. The right people are watching. They'll see exactly what they need to see.